This is the EU, a collection of 27 member states comprising 450 million citizens, and it has a total GDP of over 17 trillion euros. So it's a pretty powerful organization with large influence on many areas of European politics, and it has made it possible for Europe to maintain its standing on the world stage, since Europe only together is strong enough to rival countries like China or the US. But one thing that the EU lacks is a clear leader. The former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, is alleged to have said, "Who do I call if I want to call Europe?" highlighting how unclear it is who the EU leader actually is. So that is what this video is going to be about answering the question, who is actually the leader of the EU? Now, if I asked you who the leader of the EU is, what would you answer? Maybe you would say Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. A very common pick, reasonable choice. But what about Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council? The Council is also a very important institution, so he is also a contender here. We also have Roberta Metsola, president of the European Parliament, so the speaker of the Parliament. But then we also have the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. So, the rotating presidency, that means that every 6 months, another head of state or head of government of one of the member states becomes the rotating president. And so right now it's Denmark's prime minister. And so I would say that the top contenders to be called the EU leader is someone from these 4, main institutions of the EU: the European Commission, the European Council, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union. But then maybe some would argue that the leaders of the biggest member states are, the actual leaders. So the leaders of Germany and France, that they, because of their political and economical influence, are the actual leaders of the EU. But in this video, I'm only going to look at the official EU leaders and who is officially, or most clearly, the leader of the European Union. So then how are we going to determine who the EU's leader is? And that's a hard question, since there is no clearly stated hierarchy in the EU treaties. Now, there are maybe, you could call them hints, maybe, that kind of points in a direction of who is the most high ranked. But even then, it's a difference between who is officially the most high ranked and who has, in reality, the most power. So even that's going to be hard to use to give a clear answer. And then, of course, different EU leaders have influence over different parts of the union. So if we're talking about who has the most influence, we need to talk about influence over what, and what we value most. What kind of influence do a person who calls himself leader of the EU need to have, for that to be legitimate? Okay, so if we start by looking in the EU treaties, I didn't find much. It doesn't state who, is the EU leader, the EU head of state. But the best I could find was this, a listing of what the union's institutions shall be. And in this listing, they put the European Parliament first, which doesn't really say much, but maybe this could mean that the European Parliament is, the most high-ranked institution of the Union. And then that could mean that the president of the European Parliament is the highest-ranked EU leader and therefore should be called the EU's leader. But that seems a bit weird. First of all, because Parliament being the first institution, I think is mostly ceremonial, because it's the most democratic of the institutions. It's the only institution that is directly voted for by the people of the European Union. Every 5 years there's a European election. So I think the reason why the parliament is being listed as first is just because, it looks good to have the most democratic institution first, and it's like what you're supposed to do. But, the speaker of the parliament doesn't really have that much power. I mean, the parliament has some powers, yes, but first of all, she's only the speaker of the parliament. She doesn't have that much individual power herself. And then, yes, the parliament is has a lot of legislative power, but it shares that with the Council of the European Union. So it doesn't even have sole power of the legislative process. So the ones I think we should look at is Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council. Because it's not defined anywhere of who is the actual leader, we have to look at who's the most influential and determine it that way. So Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the Commission, and as such, she appoints commissioners who is the EU's ministers, and the Commission is the EU's executive, the government of the EU. So the civil service and implementing all the laws, that's her responsibility. And she also initiates legislation as well. So both initiating legislation and implementing it, actually, pretty big responsibility. And she also has the responsibility of representing the EU internationally. And then we have the president of the council. He leads the council meetings, which set the general direction of the EU. And so the council meetings are meetings where all the leaders of every every EU member state meet and discuss the general direction of the EU. So kind of the most powerful people of Europe are meeting and discussing the next steps of the EU. So it's a pretty big responsibility to lead those meetings. And he also represents the EU internationally. And so between these two contenders, I would say that Ursula von der Leyen clearly has more influence, as an individual. She's basically, head of the EU's government, so she could basically be called the head of government for the EU. While, even though the president of the council, Costa, also has a very, high-ranked position, I would say that his position is more ceremonial, even though he of course also has influence, leading the meetings and going on international visits. So my conclusion would be that it's unclear, it's not defined, but if we're going by who is the most influential, then it's Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, who is the EU's leader. Not officially, but unofficially, because of how much influence she has. Yeah, clearly the most influential individual in the Union, and she leads the EU's, government. So she's like the EU's head of government, the most influential person. So call her the leader if you have to call someone the leader. But maybe you just accept that there is no clear leader, and we just have leaders of different institutions, but no overall leader until the treaties get changed. Yeah, but that was it. If you thought anything was confusing, please comment and ask clarifying question, or if I got something wrong, please correct me, or if you don't agree with any of the conclusions I drew, then please let me know. Bye.